Welcome to Mideast Realities. Today we have a most unusual, most interesting guest. He's FAWAZ Turki, Palestinian writer and author who's lived in America for quite some time, was born in Palestine, left at the age of 8, I believe, FAWAZ. I think the Israelis told you that you had to leave?
1948, a lot of people left for a lot of reasons. Some people left because they wanted to escape being caught in the crossfire. Some people left because they were physically evicted, as in the case of the people who came from Lydda and Ramla. And
what happened to you and your family? Tell us.
What happened to me and my family was in April 1948. There was a lot of fighting going on in Haifa. That's where I was born. And my family lived in a certain neighborhood that was being progressively overrun by Jewish forces. And of course, we ran literally for our lives. And all wars create refugees. And these refugees leave for different reasons, essentially to seek refuge.
You ended up in a refugee camp outside of Beirut, where you grew up.
That's correct.
And at some age, you picked up and went to Australia, and then you ended up in the States, and you've done a lot of traveling, been in Europe, and you became a writer.
That's right. That pretty much sums it up in about one sentence, yes.
And the reason that we're so glad to have you today is you're one of the most prolific English language Palestinian writers. You've written 3 major books. The first one, which someone like myself read in the 70s, which was actually my introduction to the Palestinian cause, The Disinherited. Probably still your most famous book.
It is, yes. It's still in print, and it's still being used on campuses around the country as a textbook in Middle Eastern studies, in Third World literature and poetics and so on, yes.
Then in the 80s you wrote Soul in Exile, I believe, which was sort of a sequel to The Disinherited?
Pretty much, you might call it a sequel. I, being a Palestinian writer, who has lived in exile pretty much since the age of 8, certainly in Western exile since the age of, since my late teens, let's say, I have had to draw on material from my background, my tragic background as a Palestinian, you see. So clearly most of my writing is preoccupied with trying to deal with the world of exile that we inhabit, the world of Palestinians who live in refugee camps, or Palestinians who live outside the camps, but scattered around the world, not just the Arab world, do you think?
So you're a man who grew up as a child on the streets of Beirut selling chiclets for a penny. I remember that sequence in your book. You've traveled all over the world. You've been involved with the Palestinian cause, with the PLO, all your life. You've been a Palestinian writer, revolutionary. And here we now face a situation where in your latest book, which has just come out, which is Exile's Return, I believe, the unusual thing is that after a lifetime of struggle, you are now in opposition to the PLO, in opposition to Chairman Arafat, and feeling, I think, particularly incensed by the agreements that have been made in recent months.
Well, you've actually sort of made a few observations here. First of all, I have always been in opposition to the policies of the PLO. I've always been incensed, to use your term, against the PLO because of its corruption, its ineptitude, its cynicism over the years. Certainly its excesses, certainly its the waste of the human and financial resources of the Palestinian people. This is not new for me. My criticism in my new book, Exile's Return, of the PLO is not something new. I have always been critical of the PLO leadership. I have not really been against the PLO per se. That is the idea of a Palestinian institution that would embody, as an umbrella group, if you wish, and formalize the aspirations of the Palestinian people is something I've always been for. We need, definitely, as a people with a movement and a cause for statehood, we do need a body, an organization, an institution, and something like the PLO as an organization that would represent the aspirations of the Palestinian people is something that is a necessary function of our struggle. I have never been against the idea of the PLO. However, I have been against the PLO leadership over the years. This is not something new for me.
Well, let's get
in my writing, in my lectures over the years, I have been extremely vocal in my criticism of these people.
Let's get to the heart of it. What's your opinion of what has happened in the last year since the Oslo Agreement, since the Washington ceremony, since the Cairo ceremony, and since the takeover of the PLO of Jericho and Gaza?
Very briefly, I think there's been a debasement, a cheapening of the Palestinian cause. They have reduced the Palestinian cause to a fragment and turned it into an insignificant problem having to do with civil rights, i.e. the right of the Palestinians in certain parts of Palestine to pick up their garbage and distribute their mail and so on and so forth.
Why did this happen? What conditions within the Palestinian and Arab worlds made this agreement happen? What
made it happen?
Yes.
I think it was an inevitable culmination of the buffoonery of the PLO leadership over the years. This is a leadership that has led us from one diplomatic defeat to another, one military disaster to another, one act of social grief to another, and it was inevitable after they have sapped us of energy, reduced us to a fragment of our selfhood, that this would come about. The Israelis, of course, pounced on the PLO at a moment when, at the moment of weakness, and said, "Come hither. Let's see if we can turn you into mincemeat."
So you see this as a surrender of the Palestinian cause?
Unquestionably as a surrender. Not just a surrender of the rights of the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza, which, by the way, is a mere fragment of Palestinian territory. I mean, it's about 15 or maybe 18% of the original territory of historic Palestine. But
well, the West Bank hasn't been turned over to the Palestinians. Jericho, a little dot on the map.
But even if you were to include the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, they represent a mere 18% of historic Palestine. But also they have betrayed and reduced to a fragment the rights of 4 million Palestinian exiles. Nobody talks about these people.
Well, go ahead. Here's your chance.
Nobody talks about the fact that Yasser Arafat and his henchmen, no other word will do. No other word will do. I will not use colleagues or whatever. Henchmen is the word that I will use.
Now, but you know these people personally. It was just a few years ago the chairman invited you to spend a whole week with him, flying around on his Falcon, going to all his meetings. I think he wanted you to write a book about the PLO at that time, didn't he?
Yes, I have known Yasser Arafat intimately over the years, and you're correct, yes, a few years back. I did fly with him for a whole week, day in, day out. He gave me unprecedented access to him in order to write a book about him, i.e., a week in the life of Yasser Arafat. As it turned out, the book didn't pan out because there was not enough material there to warrant writing a book.
Well, you couldn't have been going around calling his people henchmen at the time. I don't.
No, I didn't call them henchmen at the time. I was unquestionably critical of them at the time. And they were tolerant of me because they felt I was a Palestinian writer, poet, artist, and therefore a little bit off. You see? And they could put up with someone like me because I'm a little bit crazy, I'm a little bit different.
Maybe a little bit independent.
A little bit independent, and they could put up with one or two people like me around.
That's why we're on public access television.
Indeed. So, but let me go back to the idea of the betrayal of the Palestinians by the PLO. The betrayal of 4 million Palestinians in exile. I mean, these people have lived for the last almost half a century waiting to have their rights addressed. And Yasser Arafat dropped them like a broken toy, threw them away like a broken toy. There are 4 times as many Palestinians in exile as there are in the West Bank and Gaza. Nobody talks about them. Why is that? You know what I'm saying? That's because because the PLO doesn't exist anymore.
Most Americans don't know the details of what you're talking about. You're talking about the Palestinians that live in refugee camps in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon in exile. You're a Palestinian American.
And Palestinians in Europe and Palestinians in North America, i.e. the States and Canada and South America. Now, all these people are people who have rights as well. Rights indeed formalized by the United Nations, the rights of repatriation and or compensation, you know? I mean, what about the Israelis? Are they going to give us reparations for all the pain and the suffering they inflicted on us? 4 million Palestinians? Huh? They can ask for reparations from the Germans, but we cannot ask for reparations from them? What's going on here? They killed us and massacred us and bombed us and terrorized us over the last half century.
And occupied you.
And occupied us, but I'm talking about the exiles now,
right.
You know? I'm talking about us, the people who nobody's talking about, you see?
What's your vision of what would be a just and a fair settlement?
I think what is going to happen ultimately is the integration of the 2 peoples of Palestine, Israelis and Palestinians. I think there will be a fusion of these 2 peoples, a kind of
Blacks and whites, one on top and one as the subclass?
No. I think what we are going to see in Palestine is the integration of Palestine, the return of Palestine to its holy state, so to speak, where we do not have one people occupying another. Now,
are you talking about what you expect, or are you talking about what you dream about?
No.
Because, I mean, let's call it straight. We only have a few minutes here on television. The Palestinian people are now in the process of being put on reservations in Bantustan.
Yeah.
Isn't that what this is all about?
Yeah, but I don't think the Israelis are going to be able to sustain that for like indefinitely, if you wish. I think what is going to happen in the end will be the integration of Palestine into one state.
Well, that's maybe a distant future goal.
Distant future, that's what I mean.
Okay.
But
But what's happening at the moment? What's your vision, Palestinian American, whose latest book is about your return after 40 years wandering in exile? That's what Exile's Return is all about. What's your vision of what's happening now?
I went back to Palestine about 3 years ago.
For the first time since being an 8-year-old kid?
For the first time since I was 8 years old. My intention was to get a feel of the home ground, what I call the home ground. To walk around towns and cities and villages where Palestinians and only Palestinians live, to get a sense of Palestinian peoplehood, if you wish.
And to see your own origins.
To see my own origins. What I saw was intifada or no intifada. What I saw was the people who had been so cowed into submission, the people who suffered pain almost beyond all rational understanding, you know. This is the case of a people who simply live in towns that look like ghost towns after like 7 o'clock in the evening, because these people prefer to be in their shuttered homes by sunset rather than to be caught by occupation soldiers or by border police, the brutal border police, you know. This is the case of people who had lived under occupation for a quarter century. and had been subjected to every manner, every shape, every form of suffering by a brutal occupation. You know, we here in the United States have no idea of the degree and the kind of suffering that the Israelis have all these years inflicted on the Palestinians. You know what I'm saying?
Well, the irony of the situation is that I'm an American Jew and I've been able to visit Israel and Palestine over 100 times in the last 15 or 20 years.
Yeah.
You're a Palestinian American and you've only been able to visit once. But I've seen the occupation. I understand what you're saying. The people have been beaten into submission. They've been just beaten down. Everything about their society's been destroyed, which is, I think, an explanation for why they ended up with the kind of agreement that they've got.
Yes, the Israelis just caught up with the PLO at a time when it had become sort of broken down in back and spirit, and offered it an agreement that would guarantee the perpetuation of occupation in a different form.
Tell us about Yasser Arafat. Tell us about what you think about the man and why he has subjugated his people to this kind of an agreement.
Well, I mean, look, Yasser Arafat is yet another Arab leader. He's not a revolutionary leader. He doesn't have the penetrative grasp of political life that, you know, Castro or Mao Zedong or Lenin
Or Mandela.
Or Mandela, thank you for reminding me, had. Yasser Arafat is a simple man, bordering on being a simpleton in terms of his grasp of the political realities of the world. He's a typical Arab leader. He's a patriarch. He is running, or he used to run, a political organization, the PLO, in the same manner that Arab leaders led their governments, led their countries.
Putting it in somewhat different language, what you're really saying is that the PLO has become a client regime of the West and of the Israelis, just as the regimes in Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt and Morocco and other places are client regimes.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Not just client regimes. These are one-man shows. Most of these countries that we call countries in the Arab world are not really countries. They are artificial creations established there by former colonial overlords. Someone like Churchill in the heyday of British power was able to go to our part of the world and say, "Let there be Jordan," and there was a Jordan.
Let there be Kuwait.
And let there be Kuwait.
Right.
The French, in like manner, said, "Let there be Lebanon," and so on and so forth.
But it's more than that. It's let there be the Saudi family ruling Saudi Arabia. Let there be the Hashemite family.
Thank you. And it's a question of not only that, but look at it. You mentioned the Saudi family and the Hashemite family. Look at how gutsy these families are. Look at Jordan. What is the official name of Jordan? The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan.
Right.
And look, Saudi Arabia is called the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This is the case of two countries that are named after the names of the ruling families in the manner of medieval fiefdoms. The family of Hashem and the family of Saud. You know what I'm saying? It's like these are the only two countries in the world that are named in this fashion. So what I was saying to you is that we have these entities, which I don't want to call countries, entities, in our part of the world, carved up by former colonial overlords, ruled by individuals, mostly patriarchal individuals or families, that rule by terror and coercion and murder and violence, and demand from their citizens, from their people, the people they rule, they demand obedience, orthodoxy, and total submission.
And this, of course, is the larger context in which the Palestinian question has been dealt with the way it's been dealt with. Because, in a sense, it's the Arab establishment along with the Americans, along with the Israelis, that wanted this kind of an agreement, that wanted to set up a client regime for the Palestinians.
That's absolutely true. I mean, we made a mistake in accepting the PLO rhetoric in the past about its identity as a revolutionary movement. PLO was never a revolutionary movement. PLO was another Arab regime ruled by another Arab patriarch, demanding from his people submission, orthodoxy, obedience.
Well, tell us more about the conditions in Palestine today then, because it's not just the PLO that has political legitimacy there. In fact, I think Hamas probably has more political legitimacy than the PLO does.
I don't know why, Mark, you keep saying the PLO. PLO doesn't exist anymore. There is no PLO. I mean, the PLO, if it exists at all, it's embodied in the person of Yasser Arafat and a couple of dozen men around him, dreaming dreams of glory about going to the West Bank one day and running the autonomy show from Jericho and Gaza. The PLO doesn't exist. Of course, it did in the past. It did. And it did represent the Palestinian people, legitimately represent the Palestinian people, because it derived this legitimacy at the time, whether it was patriarchal or not, that's irrelevant. It derived that legitimacy from three sources. It had a military force, military power, you know, the commandos and the guerrillas and the militia forces.
I think they called them the terrorists there.
Well, they call them terrorists. Here,
Right.
we call them guerrillas or freedom fighters.
Okay.
You know, Reagan called the Contras freedom fighters, and we call them terrorists.
Fair enough.
You see? So that's another point. The point is, this is one of the reasons that one of the sources
Right.
of legitimacy of the PLO at the time, namely the power profile it projected through its military forces. Another source of legitimacy, of course, for the PLO was the fact that it had all these institutions that actually helped Palestinians, or some Palestinians. You know, it had medical and educational institutions. It had institutions that opened schools, orphanages. It had economic institutions that gave gainful employment to Palestinian refugees. Plus, of course, it had political institutions that enabled many Palestinians to speak up without fear of having their heads cracked and their voices silenced or whatever. The most important of these institutions, of course, was the Palestine National Council, the legislative body of the Palestinians that had brought together Palestinians of all stripes, you know, from all stratification of class in our society. And finally, there was a time, actually, when, yet another reason as to why the PLO was legitimately in existence as a representative of the Palestinians, was the fact that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians supported the PLO. But now all of these three reasons no longer exist. The commandos or the guerrillas have gone. You may recall
they're now called police forces, aren't they?
No, not. You see, in 1982, all the Palestinian guerrillas in Lebanon were expelled, and they went and they were sent to Algeria, Yemen, Sudan, and so on. In the interim, of course, virtually 95% of these guerrillas had either found gainful employment in the Gulf countries or returned to their host states to rejoin their families. And
not to mention they got older.
Not to mention they got older, yes, since 1982. And the institutions have collapsed. The institutions that gave legitimacy to the PLO, that I mentioned earlier, have totally collapsed. Why did they collapse? They began to collapse soon after the Gulf War, when the PLO began, very simply, to go broke. These institutions no longer exist.
Well, yes, but Yasser had squandered so many millions of dollars prior to that. I mean, there was so much money that had been pumped into the PLO.
Look, there was a time when, according to some estimates I came across, reliable estimates, that the PLO controlled anything between $20 and $40 billion a year.
Billion?
Yes, sir. Billion with a B.
I mean, the magnitude of corruption, nepotism, incompetence, we all knew that for a long time.
Mark, let me tell you this, and please quote me on that. As you know, I have been intimately connected with the PLO over the years, and I know most of the top henchmen in the PLO, again that word. And I can tell you, I have seen with my own eyes, I have seen PLO officials walking around with Samsonites full of bundles of $100 bills. I have seen PLO officials squander tens of thousands of dollars on their own personal expenses.
But also, let's be clear, you're saying the PLO has been defeated, the Palestinian people are completely divided, the agreement is leading to nothing. I mean, you don't even want to talk about it. I think you're so alienated from it, you don't even want to talk about the agreement.
It's so trivial, I don't think it's worth talking about.
Well, it's hardly
So, go on
trivial.
with the question.
It's defining the new nature of the Middle East. I
It's
mean,
not defining new anything. You know, history has its own laws.
you really think this is a very transient arrangement, a temporary arrangement?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, keep in mind that what happens in Palestine, including Israel, is linked inextricably to the ebb and flow of political life in the region, which in turn is affected by what happens in the global dialogue of cultures, you know? So Palestine is a subsystem of a bigger system around it, you know? And I really believe, should there be dramatic transformations in the region, this will also affect the situation in Palestine. And I definitely, most decidedly, believe that this is not an agreement that represents a terminus of our rights. No way. No way. What about us? I am not happy with the situation. I mean, if the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza ultimately get to establish their own state, which I found to be almost virtually impossible, you know, I'll be happy for them. But hey, what about us, man? What about us Palestinians who were kicked out of Palestine? And I mean kicked out of Palestine, or terrorized into fleeing Palestine. We have no rights. I say to you, we have rights. And we're going to get together soon, and we are going to say to the world, hey, you've forgotten us, huh?